Midday, Monday to Thursday, but to the point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hi there, welcome to Brazier. Some fast-paced breaking news from 4 until 6 today. Coming up this afternoon, within the next few minutes, we're expecting the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, to make an important announcement. A statement is expected to address the investigation in County Durham into whether he broke COVID rules as the pressure mounts over whether he'll resign. It's been reported that he will say he will resign if he's given a fixed penalty notice. How much pressure does that put on the people in Durham, the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service and the police in Durham to arrive at such an important, ultimately judicial but also political decision? Will bring reaction throughout the next 2 hours as to what that means for Labour, UK politics and the police investigation. Let's start though with the latest news headlines with Tamsin.
Colin, thank you. Good afternoon. It's just after 4 o'clock. Here are the latest headlines. Sir Keir Starmer is considering whether to commit to resigning if police find he broke coronavirus rules in April last year. The Labour leader was understood to be in talks about whether to announce the pledge after pulling out of a scheduled event where he would have faced fresh questions. Labour have denied any rules were broken and have not said why he's pulled out of the speech. Sir Keir is due to make a statement shortly. Polling expert Sir John Curtis told GB News there's mounting pressure on not only Labour but also the Prime Minister over broken lockdown rules.
I mean, should it emerge that Sir Keir, in the judgment of the police, did break the rules and as a result he resigns, the pressure on the Prime Minister to resign, particularly if he were to receive another fine, would of course be very substantial. So in a sense, yes, this is for the time being put the pressure on the Labour Party and probably has caused Sir Keir not to make a speech today. But actually this could still rebound on the government if actually the judgment of the police were to be adverse for Sir Keir.
Russia's president claims he is fighting for the motherland as he defended the invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin made the comments in Moscow's Red Square amid its annual military parade to celebrate victory in World War II. Speaking this morning, the UK's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says the Kremlin is trying to intimidate other countries during its celebrations.
Putin, his inner circle and his generals are now mirroring fascism and tyranny of 77 years ago, repeating the errors of the last century's totalitarian regimes. They are showing the same disregard for human lives, national sovereignty and the rules-based international system.
Sinn Féin's Deputy Leader Michelle O'Neill has said the DUP and British government must accept and respect the result of the Assembly election. It's after Sinn Féin won a historic 27 seats in the Assembly elections last week. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Brandon Lewis, has been holding talks with the five party leaders in Stormont today. Miss O'Neill said the responsibility to find solutions to the protocol lie with Boris Johnson and the EU, but that Northern Ireland will not be held to ransom by them.
The message is one of hope. It's also one of optimism for the future, where political leaders work together and they make politics work. That's my commitment as a political leader and as an incoming First Minister. So there can be no excuses, there can be no attempt by the DUP or by anyone else to punish the public and leave workers and families high and dry now or in the time ahead. As a First Minister for all, I intend to work with those from different political perspectives through partnership and not division.
Metropolitan Police Officer David Carrick has been charged with 3 more counts of rape. The Crown Prosecution Service has increased the total charges against him to 44 offences involving 12 separate women. The 47-year-old will appear at Westminster Magistrates Court on Friday. Sri Lanka is under a nationwide curfew after members of the ruling party attacked anti-government protesters in Colombo. The Prime Minister has offered his resignation in the wake of the demonstrations. Soaring prices and power cuts have led to the protests amid the country's worst financial crisis since independence in 1948. At least 20 people were injured in violence outside the Prime Minister and President's offices. The boss of Scottish Power says more needs to be done to lower energy bills ahead of winter as prices are predicted to go up again. Keith Anderson has urged the government to take action, adding that bills are due to rise by almost £1,000 for millions of households by next winter. Downing Street has confirmed the Queen is due to deliver her address at the state opening of Parliament tomorrow. The palace will, however, confirm her attendance in the morning. It's after it was announced other senior royals would take over Her Majesty's duties in hosting garden parties at Buckingham Palace. The Queen's agenda-setting speech is expected to include a number of government plans, including how to deal with the Northern Ireland's post-Brexit trading arrangements, levelling up Britain's high streets, and a crackdown on truancy in schools. This is GB News. I'll bring you more news as it happens. Now, though, straight back to Colin.
Fasten your seatbelts. Within the next few moments, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, is expected to make a statement addressing an investigation by Durham police into whether he broke COVID rules when drinking beer at an MP's office in the city of Durham. After being a hugely vocal critic of Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the Partygate scandal, those Downing Street gatherings during the COVID lockdown, the Labour leader has faced criticism, strong criticism, as well as calls for his own resignation. We're going to be talking to Arlene Foster, former First Minister, in just a moment about what that means as a political gamble. There she is. But first, we're going to be joined by our political correspondent, Tom Harwood, who's in Westminster, outside where that meeting is happening, where the announcement's about to be made. Tom, so much to talk about within this. At first blush, I just keep looking at the fact you've got some presumably relatively junior officials at one of the country's smallest police forces facing a really important decision. And into this comes this pledge, if that's what's happening here, a pledge from Keir Starmer, which can't fail but be, to some degree, prejudicial.
Well, that is the concern, and many opponents of the leader of the Labour Party are suggesting that that is exactly what this press conference is about. It's hard to see how making this issue into such a big story as this press conference is doing today helps the Labour leader in any way other than perhaps placing some pressure on Durham Constabulary, on that handful of police officers who will be looking at all of this new evidence, investigating for the first time this alleged breach of the rules, this curry and beer evening with up to 30 people at a time when indoor socialising was against the rules in the UK. It's a situation that is analogous to that of the one in which the Chancellor and Prime Minister were fined in the Cabinet Room for an event on the 19th of June 2020, when similarly outdoor socialising was allowed, indeed working with others was allowed for key workers, but crucially indoor socialising was not allowed. For that, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister received fixed penalty notices from the Metropolitan Police, and now exactly the same assessment is taking place with the leader of the Labour Party. It's extraordinary to see that we have gone from a situation where the leader of the Labour Party was cancelling an event due to take place this afternoon with free and open questions from the press. That was cancelled this morning with the Labour leader saying that diary clashes were in the way. Well, now we've arrived at a fully fledged press conference. In front of it I have to say, a select group of media. Not all of Her Majesty's press lobby were allowed in. I have not been allowed in to that press conference, and there are a number of colleagues of mine who haven't either.
Yeah. And the ones who are there, Tom, we have the benefits of being a TV station, that we have TVs here in the newsroom, and we're watching them and transcribing what's been said. You're not being allowed in. A select group, as you say, have been, and we can tell our viewers and listeners that it is the case that Sir Keir Starmer is making this pledge that he will resign, he will stand down if it's found that if he is given a fixed penalty notice for breaching those COVID rules in April last year. I just wonder, Tom, there's a way of looking at this which suggests he must be pretty confident as a former lawyer, indeed as a former Director of Public Prosecutions, no less, head of the CPS. He knows all about evidential bars, the likelihood of securing a prosecution. This is what he did for years. He must be confident he's going to get off.
Well, that is one way of reading it, of course, and let's not forget that Durham Police Force was the police force that sort of let Dominic Cummings off without issuing Dominic Cummings a fixed penalty notice for his long and famous drive to Durham. It's interesting how Durham has become the focal point of so much of our politics in the last few years. But yes, to some extent, there is that argument that Sir Keir Starmer thinks he has done nothing wrong. Although, on the other hand, it must be said Rishi Sunak thought he had done nothing wrong, was not expecting a fine. Many people in Westminster were very surprised when the Chancellor of the Exchequer received a fine for attending a meeting in the Cabinet Room where there happened to be cake. So really, there is all to play for here. I suppose the other calculation is how could Sir Keir Starmer continue on in his job after making such an issue of Partygate for the last 4-5 months, for calling for the resignation of the Prime Minister at the start of, not at the conclusion of the police investigation, but at the start of the police investigation, and indeed calling for the resignation of the Chancellor of the Exchequer for his transgression, which many people would see is a relatively low bar for these fixed penalty notices to be issued. It's clearly a huge gamble, but to some extent it's the leader of the Labour Party who has himself boxed himself into this corner today by talking up the issue of resignation of the Chancellor and the Prime Minister so much for so long. Really, now that the investigation has started on the Labour Party, there's very little else he can do without appearing incredibly hypocritical. The one question that many people will be asking Sir Keir Starmer today, however, is at what point, what threshold does that pledge for resignation reach? If, for example, the police were to say a minor offence occurred and one they will not pursue or issue a fine for, as they did in the case of Dominic Cummings, would he resign in that case as well, if he avoided a fixed penalty notice but the police acknowledged that some wrongdoing may have taken place? It's also important to note here the political consequences of this. It's hard to know that many people in the country would not now know of this event in a way that very few people knew of this event unless they were complete political anoraks in the last few weeks. Well, as a result of this press conference, this is leading press bulletins around the country, and just this morning YouGov, the polling organisation, found that 54% of the country believe that the leader of the Labour Party has probably or definitely broken those rules. This is a massive shift in the way that people are viewing the Labour Party right now, so it's hard to see how the Labour Party leader could do anything else. Conversely, it's odd to see that the Conservative Party is saying that Keir Starmer potentially shouldn't resign, that a fixed penalty notice is, in their eyes, not something worthy of resignation, something, as one backbench Conservative MP said in previous weeks, akin to a parking ticket. Is this really the level at which we should have senior politicians resigning? However, of course, ultimately, as so many political scandals do, this comes down to the charge of hypocrisy.
Tom, I think I can hear the distinctive whir of rotor blades above your head, which suggests that maybe a rival news operation has put the chopper up. Always an indication they view it as a very big story. Tom, so much to muse on there. You might need to go and take a break. It'd be great to talk to you as soon as possible. In the meantime, let's just talk to Arlene Foster, as a former First Minister of Northern Ireland, was booked actually to talk about Sinn Féin, power sharing, Stormont, all the rest of it. But this is an important story, and I'm very keen, as a former front-rank politician yourself, to see how much of a high-wire act this is. It feels like we're at the beginnings of a political psychodrama here a little bit.
Absolutely. The soap opera continues. And I think what he's trying to do is to put clear blue water between himself and the Prime Minister. He's been very clear that if he's found guilty, albeit a fixed penalty ticket, that he's going to resign to make that differential between himself and the PM. That's why the Conservatives are saying that he doesn't need to resign if he gets a fixed parking ticket. If he gets a fixed penalty ticket, he doesn't need to resign. But, of course, he is a former lawyer. He is a former head of the DPP. He used to be the legal advisor to the Northern Ireland Policing Board when I sat on the Northern Ireland Policing Board. So he has this reputation as a lawyer and one that sticks by the rules. And he is saying, look, if I get a fixed penalty ticket, I will go. But I have to say to you, Colin, I think it's putting an inordinate amount of pressure on the police service in Durham, because they're now in a situation. He could have done this at the end of the investigation. Yeah. When the outcome was known.
This investigation, for what it's worth, I read, is going to last for 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah.
You know, if you're the chief, you know, spare a thought for Durham Police, spare a thought for their chief constable today. If I were them, I'd be drafting now an explanation as to how this process works. So we can have as much transparency to what's just become an ad hoc but terribly important process.
It's an incredibly important process. It reminds me of what happened in Northern Ireland over the funeral of Bobby Storey, when Sinn Féin went to a funeral that they shouldn't have been at, of course, because there were rules and regulations in place. And that became a whole political drama in Northern Ireland, as you're aware. Of course, when Nicola Sturgeon stepped over the line and didn't wear a mask when she should have been wearing a mask, she was just given an advice and warning. What happens if he's just given an advice and warning? Is he going to resign then? I think that's the point Tom was making.
He was. Emma Webb's alongside Arlene today. You're going to be here for the next couple of hours or thereabouts. First blush, there's always that danger, I think we were just described by Tom Harwood as anoraks. The anoraks go over the top about this and ignore the rest of the day's news. How important is this story?
I think it's quite important, because I think that Keir Starmer's actually getting himself into a real muddle here, because in trying to distance himself from Boris Johnson, I think what he's actually done, and you hit the nail on the head by saying that this could prejudice the investigation, he's actually acted in a way that is less above board than Boris. When Boris refused to resign or to take a stance, he actually wasn't pressuring the investigation in that way. Yeah. And I think that he's tying himself up in a web of hypocrisy here. As you mentioned, the fact that he used to be the leader of the CPS, the fact that the Labour Party, I think, are actually more hypocritical because they called for more rules at the time. And so actually I think that Keir Starmer is really setting himself up for a real fall here. And given that this has come just after success in the local elections, which is probably partly to do with the failure of the Conservative Party more than the success of the Labour Party, he's actually not only putting himself in a muddle, but actually dragging the whole of the Labour Party into it, which, being bad for the opposition, is also not good for the Conservative Party, because it means that they won't have anybody to really rough up against. We're
going to talk to a former senior police officer who can shed some light on the processes around this and how Durham Police will weigh the evidence such as it is. But before we let Arlene Foster go, in all this, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that actually these rules to a lot of people were bewildering, particularly in their interpretation. And this idea that Boris Johnson would have accepted the cake if he knew it would potentially lead to his political ruin, of course he wouldn't have done. No. And by extension, it has to be true, doesn't it, that Sir Keir Starmer wouldn't have gone into the Miners' Hall, accepted that bottle of beer and the biryani if he knew this is where it would end up. Yeah.
Well, here's the problem. In Northern Ireland, when the CPS and the police looked at the rules and regulations, one of the reasons why they didn't prosecute senior Sinn Féin members was because they said we're too confusing. And they said that they could mount a defence to what had actually happened. When everybody seen them on the TV attending this funeral, everybody else was abiding by the rules and regulations and not going to funerals of their families and friends. But apparently the rules and regulations were confusing. So I would imagine that some of that will rub off in the Durham investigation as well. But it hasn't in the Metropolitan investigation, which I found very interesting.
Interesting feels like a euphemism in that instance, doesn't it? Arlene Foster, I know you've got to go, but really appreciate you sticking around to talk about it. Thanks very much indeed. Well, what does this likely announcement, the announcement as now is, and let me just give you the quote exactly, by the way, from Sir Keir Starmer. I'll do the right thing and step down. That his pledge this afternoon. I'll do the right thing and step down if he's fined by Durham Police. But how do Durham Police go about their investigation? Does it put, well, it does, doesn't it, intense pressure on their inquiry? Joining me now, former Scotland Yard detective Peter Blexley. Peter, welcome to you. We're into murky territory, aren't we, really, here? And this feels a little bit like something new under the sun. You've got one of the country's smallest police forces. They don't have the levels of personnel that bigger forces, not least the one you used to serve in, have at their disposal. What will they do? He was going to be stumped by that question, so he's pulled the cable out. I hate it when that happens, don't you? He's come back. Peter Blexley, I'm told it was back and then I was told it had gone. It's gone. But I tell you who's just arriving here in the studio, I'm delighted to say, is our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, to reflect on the significance or otherwise of this story. He's We'll be reflecting on it too. Just while Darren's mic's been fixed,
I'm on. I've just listened to what Keir Starmer had to say. He, his main argument is that he wants to define this as the politicians are different, and that he is a man of principle. He's obviously, of course, the former director of public prosecutions, and that he feels and argues that, unlike the Prime Minister, on a point of principle, he says he would resign if he's given a fixed penalty notice. Now, first of all, lots of questions for Sir Keir Starmer, not least of all, you've called on the Prime Minister to resign when he was not fined, but initially when he was simply under police investigation, which is where, of course, Keir Starmer finds himself now. So why not a point of principle that you would resign when you've been investigated, given that's what you've called, that's where you've set the bar for the Prime Minister. And second of all, there is these concerns about clearly the pressure that may well be put on Durham Police. Now, Labour are suggesting that if they didn't make this statement today, simply every day for the next month or however long this investigation goes on for, Keir Starmer would be asked that question over and over and over and over again, and that they simply need to provide an answer to it.
So in doing that, he's taken the bag of trouble from his own lap, and he's put that bag of troubles and woes into the laps of the Chief Constable and others at Durham Police.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, in saying that, I spoke to Richard Holden, Conservative MP, earlier on, who's the MP for Durham North West. His argument is whatever people's politics and whatever consequence decisions make, the police still have to independently investigate these themselves without fear or favour. But yes, I mean, is it now a more significant call, not just to fine Keir Starmer, but effectively, to call...
This is the man who, on current polling, will be our next Prime Minister.
And it will now be potentially up to Durham Police to whether he is the leader of the opposition or not. And the reason I think that's important is because what is clear with these fixed penalty notices, and indeed with the coronavirus rules, is it is not black and white. There is a lot of room for interpretation here, and there is a feeling that maybe that this is an act that actually puts so much pressure the police will roll back from it all. But in the end, this is a gamble. This is also... Let's not forget this. This is a big gamble for Keir Starmer. If he is fined, he is gone.
And Darren, it's turned on a dime. I mean, this morning, the briefing from Labour was the opposite of this.
Yeah. I mean, clearly, and he kept saying this, that no rules are broken. He feels no rules are broken. The Labour Party want to give a sense that they're pretty confident he will not be fined. And we should also reflect on this kind of very briefly as well. If he was to go... clearly, that would pile more pressure on the Prime Minister too. It would pile more pressure on Boris Johnson, potentially with the possibility the Prime Minister may be fined more than once. And that is why, in some ways, it's potentially quite a clever political strategy from the Labour Party, but it is a hell of a gamble. This is Keir Starmer's job really effectively on the line.
Yeah, and it's Darren will say thanks very much indeed for now. We're going to go back to Peter Blexley. We think we've got the line working. Former Scotland Yard detective. For that perspective, as Darren McCaffrey was explaining there, a lot of pressure on the police investigation to arrive at a determination here without being prejudiced by the fact that we've now got this pledge from Keir Starmer to resign as leader of the opposition if he's found guilty. If he's given a fixed penalty. We're not quite clear exactly what the definition is of falling foul of the law on this one. Peter Blexley, welcome to you. I was just saying before we were interrupted by technical failings earlier that I can't think of anything remotely like this in the interplay between law enforcement and politics. This feels pretty unprecedented.
Well, of course, you'll always hear senior police officers, certain senior police officers saying, keep politics out of policing. And here Durham find themselves mired very much in a political kind of investigation. But this isn't pressure for detectives. Pressure for detectives is when there's a murderer on the loose or when there's a terrorist on the loose and lives are at risk. This is a low-level, minor offence. And as Darren mentioned earlier, that famous phrase, without fear or favour, this straightforward, low-level investigation should be conducted thoroughly and properly, but really, in the terms of serious detective work, this doesn't come anywhere close to being serious.
And Peter, you're right to make that point. Of course, by comparison with what's happening, the nitty-gritty of policing, murders and serious crimes, this is as nothing. And yet people will be entitled to be curious about what this process now looks like, in whose gift it is ultimately to bring this case to a successful conclusion, to sift through the evidence, such as it is, and arrive at what has now become a very, very important determination. And I just wonder whether, I mean, I've got a number of questions, and you may be fit to answer some of them. I don't know if you may need a very specific knowledge of Durham Police to know exactly who makes this decision. On what basis they make it. We're told it's going to be 6 to 8 weeks to arrive at this decision. But there are, is it the Crown Prosecution Service? Does it fall into the lap of the Chief Constable? I don't know, do you?
The investigation, I'm sure, will be overseen, rather ironically, by the head of the Serious Crime Command, whatever name Durham attached to that. But essentially, I would be surprised if an officer above the rank of Chief Superintendent had responsibility for having a hands-on approach to it. The Chief Constable, of course, might want to keep a very close eye and be updated regularly by the investigation team. But let's just look at that investigation, if we may. An allegation of a breach of COVID rules. Well, OK, so there's been some pictures in the media. Examine those. See if you can find the people responsible for taking them. Is there any CCTV that might support that? Any mobile phone records, of course, which might be of some use. And, of course, interview witnesses. Who was there? Who saw what? Who did what? And that in itself is pretty much the investigation wrapped up.
Peter Blexley, for now, thanks very much indeed for giving us that instant reaction. Really appreciate it. Darren McCaffrey, our political editor, still alongside me with that full statement from Sir Keir. I think we can read that now, can we?
Well, actually, I mean, Keir Starmer repeatedly saying, no rules broken, point of principle, but we've also heard from Angela Rayner in the last couple of minutes, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, who is also saying that she would resign if fined. So that's the leader and the deputy leader of the party saying in a statement they would go. She said that I've been clear that I was at the event in Durham. But
she wasn't initially clear about it.
We'll say that is not. Well, we don't know about her personally. I mean, let's say the Labour Party weren't necessarily very clear. In fact, they were far from clear. They got it wrong that she was there. So that she wasn't there, which they had claimed she was there. She says, I've always been clear that I was at the event in Durham working in my capacity as deputy leader. No rules were broken. Eating during a long day's work was not against the rules, she claims. We've a Prime Minister's been fined for breaking the rules, lied about it, and then been fined. If I was issued with a fine, I would do the decent thing and step down. So, as I say, I come back to this point. Yes, there's pressure on the police. This could well result on pressure on the Prime Minister too, but my word, it's not every day you've got the leader and the deputy leader essentially saying that they will go on circumstances that now are entirely out of their control.
I was thinking about Labour pledges. Remember the old pledge card?
The 5 pledges.
That was the previous pledge. We pledged to increase spending on the National Health
Service. It certainly
Service.
wasn't, I'm going to quit my job if the police find me guilty or something.
It's one hell of a pledge, isn't it? Darren, for now, thanks very much indeed. Let's get some political reaction to this breaking story. To discuss this, the Conservative peer, Lord Ralph Lucas. Welcome to you. Your thoughts?
Good afternoon. This is totally stupid. I mean, would you really want the headmaster of your child's school to resign under these circumstances, or if they got a speeding fine for doing 45 in a 30-mile area? No, it's totally out of proportion. The sort of world where people have to quit their jobs over this sort of thing is not a world that any of us should want to be part of. How we've got here.
Yeah, does it not make a difference that he seemed to have set those parameters, having said so vehemently that if there was a fixed penalty notice given to Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak, then they ought to resign? He set the bar this high. He now has to jump over it because he put it there.
Yes, he's stuck, but it's stupid. It really is. I mean, there is no way in which this should be. I mean, his colleagues should have taken a more rational view of what went on in Downing Street. I mean, it's a much more serious set of allegations against the Prime Minister. A lot more occasions, a lot more involved. There's no way in which Keir Starmer should have been so hard on Rishi Sunak, who merely dropped into something that he didn't know was happening. By going against Rishi Sunak for that, he set the bar really high, and now he may fail that test. But it's stupid. We shouldn't be doing it.
I'm just checking my notes that you are actually a Conservative peer, saying that, the allegations against Boris Johnson are more serious.
Absolutely they are. I mean, they're much more extensive, and they're much more deliberate, and they're much more organised and to my mind, clear. I personally still don't think it's a resigning matter, but there is a measure of difference between the two.
Not a reminder, though, whether it's Boris Johnson's case or Keir Starmer's case, that neither of these highly evolved political animals would have taken the risk that they've taken, cake, biryani, if they knew it would lead to their political ruin. It reminds us all of how incredibly difficult it was to interpret complicated laws in real time, in real world scenarios. And actually, a lot of us broke those rules, sometimes inadvertently.
And what it's like operating under pressure in the middle of a storm like that. I mean, it is really, really hard. We should not be setting this sort of bar for the Prime Minister or for Sir Keir. It doesn't lead to a pleasant society if those are the standards you set generally. We should be more forgiving, more understanding of how people react when they are in the sort of circumstances which those two have been under.
Lord Ralph Lucas, we appreciate your thoughts today, and I think many people will agree with you that we need to be a little bit more forgiving, a little more understanding. It was a national crisis, after all, wasn't it? Lord Ralph Lucas, thanks for your time, really appreciate it. Emma Webb's my studio guest throughout the course of this afternoon. We were expecting to talk about lots of other different stories. For now, we're talking about one. Are we right to?
I think so, and I agree with Lord Lucas, actually. I think that this is, in many ways, quite stupid. But I think, actually, that highlights the hypocrisy of the Labour Party, that all throughout the pandemic, they were asking for the laws and the restrictions to be harder, longer, and always demanding more. And now that they've shown themselves, there are a multitude of videos that have been posted online in the last couple of hours of people, of Labour Party MPs, but particularly Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, calling for resignations on the Conservative side. So I think actually this is, in some ways, shows an extreme hypocrisy. But actually, if you think just a few steps ahead, Darren mentioned the pressure that this will put onto Boris Johnson. I don't know whether or not that could potentially backfire. As I say, if you think a few steps ahead, given that the Labour Party have just done so well in the local elections, partly because of the failure of the Conservative Party, you would think that they would want Boris Johnson to stay in his post because it is to the benefit of the Labour Party. Whereas if Boris Johnson is replaced by someone, perhaps someone like Ben Wallace, that might no longer be the case. So I don't know what strategy they have got long-term on this, but it seems to me to be a very high risk.
The thing is, you don't need to be addicted to cop dramas to know that investigations, particularly if they're spread over several weeks, can often yield material they didn't start with. Somebody somewhere may have a smartphone with footage on of something else. We just don't know. And that's the risk that Sir Keir Starmer's taken down. Can I come back to you in just a second? Hold that thought if you would, because I want to read to our viewers and listeners this statement from Sir Keir Starmer, delivered at the top of the hour. He said, quote, "No rules were broken. I have been absolutely clear about that from start to finish, and I've set out today the in-principle position that I believe in. Unlike those at Downing Street, I don't think that those that make the laws can then simply breach them and not take action." He went on, "I believe that if you've made a law, you should respect the law, and if you're found to be in breach of it, you should step down, and that's what I've set out clearly this afternoon." Just a brief thought, if we can, before we go to the news from Darren McCaffrey. It's a huge political gamble, this.
A huge political gamble, but it's one that, as you guys have been talking about, that Keir Starmer has boxed himself into by calling for the Prime Minister and for the Chancellor to resign because they've been fined. Angela Rayner in the last couple of minutes saying she would do the same. But I think, frankly, he didn't have a choice, and he knew that over the coming weeks and months he was going to repeatedly ask this question or not. Labour seem pretty confident he's not going to be fined, but you're right in suggesting that clearly, and this is why the Rishi Sunak example is a very good one, is that he was in the cabinet room when someone walked in with a birthday cake. He had no idea it was going to happen, and yet he was fine. So if that is also the bar of prosecution, you'd have to say that even if Keir Starmer, and you think, I haven't watched the statement, I think he probably wholeheartedly believes himself that he has not broken any rules, but given how complex they were, how widely open they are to interpretation, he cannot guarantee that, and that is why it is a real proper gamble. And just on that point you were making quickly about new evidence, a couple of weeks ago we didn't know Angela Rayner was there. Yeah. Clearly at the weekend we found out that in many ways this curry had been scheduled. So, there is lots of stuff that can repeatedly come out.
More from Darren, more from Emma. Very shortly we're going to take you to the rest of the day's news now with Tamsin.
Thank you, Colin. Good afternoon from the GB newsroom. So Keir Starmer has said he will step down as Labour leader if he's fined by police. His deputy, Angela Rayner, says she'll also quit if fined. It's after an investigation was launched into allegations Sir Keir broke coronavirus rules at a curry and beer gathering in Durham in April of last year. Sir Keir insists he has always followed the rules. Northern Ireland's incoming First Minister, Sinn Féin's Michelle O'Neill, says the DUP and the British government must accept and respect the result of the Assembly election. Her party won a historic 27 seats in the Assembly elections last week. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Brandon Lewis, has been holding talks with the 5 party leaders in Stormont today. Russia's president has claimed he's fighting for the motherland as he defended the invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin made the comments in Moscow's Red Square during the annual military parade celebrating victory in World War II. The UK's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace is accusing the Kremlin of trying to intimidate other countries during today's celebrations. The Russian ambassador to Poland has been covered in red paint by protesters. Sergei Ondrev and his entourage were attacked by a crowd in the capital, Warsaw. They were attending a wreath-laying ceremony marking the 77th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Metropolitan Police Officer David Carrick has been charged with 3 more counts of rape. The Crown Prosecution Service has increased the total charges against him to 44 offences involving 12 separate women. The 47-year-old will appear at Westminster Magistrates Court on Friday. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. In just a moment, it's back to Colin.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's 2 questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
almost 21 minutes to 5 here with GB News on TV, online and on digital radio. We're bringing you a reaction to the news that Sir Keir Starmer has said he will, quote, do the right thing and step down as Labour leader if he's fined by police over an allegation that he broke coronavirus laws at a curry and beer gathering in Durham. With introductions like that, what do they make of news in Britain and abroad? It's one of those very, very peculiarly British stories, isn't it? In a statement just over half an hour ago, the Labour leader said this: no rules were broken. I have been absolutely clear about that from start to finish, and I have set out today the in-principle position that I believe in. Unlike those at Downing Street, I don't think those that make the laws can then simply breach them and not take action, he went on. I believe that if you've made a law, you should respect the law, and if you're found to be in breach of it, you should step down. And that's what I've set out clearly this afternoon. Let's get a much-needed legal perspective on this. We can cross live to the barrister and political commentator, Francis Hoare. Francis, welcome to you. Do you know what the legal process that Durham Constabulary, one of the smallest police forces in the country, presumably with the resources to match, i.e. not very much, what legal process they will bring to bear, and ultimately in whose gift it is to decide, yes, we are bringing a prosecution and it will be for this offence?
Well, an important clarification is that it wouldn't be, in the first instance, a prosecution. It would be an offer to Sir Keir to accept a fixed penalty notice, which, as your previous guest, Lord Horton, I think it was, correctly said, is the same means by which you are given a speeding fine and a speeding conviction, or a speeding recognition of a speeding offence. What that means is that you accept that fixed penalty notice. It is not the same as necessarily as an acceptance of guilt of a criminal offence, and the police cannot prosecute you for that offence at that particular time if you accept the fixed penalty notice. You've got 21 or possibly 28 days to accept it. That's the consequence. So in the first instance, the police are just deciding whether or not they are going to offer him that. If Sir Keir were to say, no, I'm not going to accept that fixed penalty notice, he would have the right to challenge that. I think there is a very significant problem with what Sir Keir has said. He is the ex-DPP. He knows very well that an important principle, a very important principle of our legal system is that you are, first of all, you are innocent until you're proven guilty. And secondly, that the police investigating or making a decision does not automatically mean that that decision is correct. He seems to be setting himself up to accept whatever decision the Durham Police Constabulary make about this without challenging it, because he has said, if I am found to have done, if I'm found to have committed an offence, then I will resign. Well, he's told the country that he didn't do it. If that's the case, if the Durham Constabulary decide to offer him a fixed penalty notice, he should refuse to take it, he should challenge them to prosecute him, and he should put his case in court. As the ex-DPP, he surely knows and has come to a reasonable legal decision as to whether, on what he knows that he did, he committed an offence. And if that is the case, then he should refuse to accept a fixed penalty notice and insist that he is prosecuted, or as it might be said, that police put up or shut up if he doesn't accept that fixed penalty notice.
Francis, as a journalist, I'm enjoined to be very careful about what I say. I don't think we use the phrase, only sort of older police officers use the phrase sub judice anymore. I don't think it's got any place in the laws that govern the way journalists now report cases. But journalists are careful about prejudicing quasi-judicial processes, as this seems to be. In what way is what Sir Keir Starmer has said today not potentially prejudicial?
Again, I find what he has said to be a deeply inappropriate thing for a politician, but particularly for the ex-director of public prosecutions to have said. He must know that he is putting considerable and inappropriate pressure on the Durham Constabulary to dismiss this, because quite clearly it will be far more easy for them to do that rather than to decide to offer him, and that is, as I said, it is only that, to offer him the opportunity to agree to a fixed penalty notice. It is not an appropriate thing to do. And what view one takes, I tend to take the same view as Lord Horton took, which is that these are not offences. I personally believe they should never have been offences, and that it is utterly preposterous that we are discussing curry evenings in Durham and a birthday cake in Downing Street, and even gathering outside in very large gardens in small groups in April in Downing Street. All of these preposterous to suggest that these should have been offences in any circumstances. But I agree that Sir Keir and Boris Johnson have hoisted themselves by their own petard by making them offences, and have certainly both of them look as though they're being deeply hypocritical. But we must focus on the important things and not the triviality. And the important thing here is that Sir Keir Starmer has firstly undermined the important principle that the police do not decide whether or not somebody is innocent or guilty. And secondly, the presumption of innocence. He's undermined that, in my view, by saying what he did, indicating that he would agree to whatever the police decide. And thirdly, he has put deeply inappropriate pressure on the Durham Constabulary by saying that he will resign depending upon what they decide. None of these are appropriate for a leader of the opposition, and they're particularly inexcusable for the ex-DPP.
Francis, you sound quite angry.
Well, I find, sorry, I try not to be, but this comes after 2 years in which this country has been put through unprecedented measures, criminalising ordinary behaviour, contrary to all previous recommendations, contrary to the rule of law, with incredibly little scrutiny, particularly from the leader of the opposition. And what we're concentrating on is not the enormous consequences of the government and Parliament behaving in this way, and the press and the leader of the opposition and the opposition doing nothing about it. But we're arguing about who had a curry in Durham, and that leads then to what I think is deeply inappropriate behaviour by the ex-DPP and now leader of the opposition, putting pressure on a police constabulary, and also undermining the rule of law that he particularly has a duty to support. So yes, I am angry about this, actually, Colin.
Yeah. No, Francis, there's so much. We've got another guest I'm very keen to get to, but I'm very keen, if we can, just to address a process question. Do you know, does anybody know at this stage, whether Durham Police, in arriving at this determination, will use a set of transparent, public, national guidelines, or whether in that slightly archaic, we like it this way, 40-plus individual police forces based on county lines usually, this will just be a decision in the gift of Durham Police?
Well, the norm is that the police will first of all decide whether or not an offence has been committed in their view, looking at the evidence, and secondly, whether it's appropriate to offer that person a fixed penalty notice or just to do no more about it. And in the norm, you would, as I think one of your police guests said earlier, he wouldn't expect an officer over the rank of chief superintendent or something of that nature to be making these decisions. Normally, you'd expect it to be made by a sergeant, perhaps an inspector, if not even a police constable. But again, Sir Keir's statement has put the police under pressure, and obviously they'll be under pressure given the high profile of this alleged offence and the very high profile and high standing of those alleged to have committed it. So the process is similar to deciding on a prosecution. It's the twofold process, which is firstly, is there a reasonable suspicion that an offence, or rather, is there a reasonable prospect of conviction? And secondly, whether or not it's in the public interest to prosecute. That's the decision that they would have to make if they were deciding on a prosecution. But they're deciding first on whether to offer a fixed penalty notice, and a similar sort of process must take place. As to what process they take in making that decision, in the norm, it would be a police officer of a fairly junior rank making almost not a straw in the wind decision, but a decision that just looking, a common sense decision. Is this serious enough to merit a fixed penalty notice, or can we just let this go? That's the kind of thing they do all the time.
Francis, we've got to move on, but I mean that's the point, isn't it? In the normal run of the things, this would be a very pretty junior officer at one of the smallest forces in the country making a decision, which we now know, because he said so, will determine the fortunes and the political fortunes of a man who, on current polling, is destined to be the next Prime Minister. That does feel wrong. Francis, look, we've got to leave it there, but really appreciate your expertise, as ever. Francis Hawke.
My pleasure.
Is there. Let's turn to the Economist and Labour Party donor, John Mills, for a perspective on this. John Mills, thanks for your time. Appreciate you joining us. Is John Mills there? Can we talk to John Mills? Almost there. Stay with us, John Mills. Hi to you, John Mills, and thanks for your patience. We just had a respected barrister there, just musing on what he felt was the absurdity, really, of a small police force now put in a position which he considers to be prejudicial. They know that if they arrive at a determination to give a fixed penalty notice to the leader of the opposition, he will resign.
Well, I think we're in a really bizarre situation where something, in the big scheme of things, as trivial as what happened in Durham with Sir Keir Starmer, has got us into a situation where the leader of the opposition may be forced to resign, while the Prime Minister, who clearly in 10 Downing Street was involved in much more serious offences, if that's what they were, against the rules that around during the pandemic, gets away with it, as I think he may well do. I mean, I think this is a really tragic situation that Sir Keir Starmer's got himself into, but you can see how it's happened. It's like the sort of Greek tragedy of one problem piling up on another one and boxing people into a corner.
John Mills.
And I think it's a really sad day that we've got into this position.
Is he not the author of his own misfortune, though? Because had he not been quite so vehement in saying if the Prime Minister gets a fixed penalty notice, he ought to resign, he set the bar very high. He set the bar very high for himself, it turns out.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think that you can see step by step along the way how he got into that position. But I do think it's very sad that this has happened, and that somebody of the stature of Sir Keir Starmer, and with all his reputation for integrity, which he certainly richly deserves, has got himself into this position. But that's where we are.
Do you think he's made a mistake by making this statement today?
I'm very sad that he did make this statement, because I've got a huge regard, as many other people have, for Sir Keir Starmer, and he's obviously boxed himself into a very tight position here. Yes, I think that he was in difficulty about doing anything else, bearing in mind where he was, and I'm very sad that we got to this position.
It's a position, I mean, you draw a distinction, John Mills, between allegations of what happened in Downing Street with this, and you say one was more serious than the other. In the minds of many people, it will be a reminder that neither individual set out to find themselves facing fixed penalty fines or receiving them in the case of Boris Johnson, because if they'd known something as seemingly innocuous could lead to their political ruin, of course they'd never have done it. And that's just a reminder of just how difficult it was to interpret these lockdown laws in real time.
Well, I think that's correct. And I think that neither of them intended to infringe the law. I mean, I think that, to be fair, Boris Johnson is more in error because it happened more frequently, and there was clearly a wrong sort of culture in 10 Downing Street. But I think that in the Keir Starmer's case, he obviously had absolutely no intention of breaking the law. There was no sort of mens rea there. And to be caught up into the problems that he's now got, I think it's just terribly sad, and rather a commentary on the sort of paucity of balance in British politics sometimes when this sort of circumstance arises.
John Mills, there we have to leave it. We very much appreciate your time and your thoughts today. Thanks very much indeed. Let's get the thoughts of Darren McCaffrey, our political editor, who's going to be moving on to cover this story from a different location, I think, soon. So we'll enjoy you while we can, Darren. Your thoughts over the course of this hour?
I think let's get away from kind of the police investigation and that sort of stuff and I want to look at the wider politics. And I come back to this because I feel today that Keir Starmer really didn't have a choice today. Lots of people saying, why has he done this? Why is he taking this gamble? Fundamentally, because it would have been politically crippling if he didn't come out today. You know, this is a man, first of all, that has portrayed himself as a former director of public prosecutions, which he repeatedly brings up at PMQs, as someone who has always argued he's a politician of principle, that he's different from the Prime Minister, but fundamentally has called on the Prime Minister to resign because he's received a fixed penalty notice. If he did not come out and say today or tomorrow or yesterday, whenever, that he was prepared to resign over this issue, every single interview he would have done, could you imagine what PMQs would be like? He just would have been driven into the ground. It would have been politically crippling. So, frankly, he didn't have much choice today. Now, he's got himself into this position. I'm not feeling sorry for him here. He's the person who's put himself in this, but he had no choice today. And it is a massive gamble. And it's a massive gamble because of all the stuff that you've been exploring over the last hour, Colin. And that is that I think he genuinely believes he didn't break the rules. But the point is, I think the Chancellor also probably genuinely felt that he hadn't broken.
And let me tell you something else, Darren. Emma Webb, feel free to make a point on this. Francis Hoare, leading barrister who we talked to 15 minutes ago, he's absolutely certain as well that this is absolutely inappropriate. A member of his tribe, a fellow lawyer, a very senior one, former Director of Public Prosecutions no less, ought, he said, to know better. He was really quite angry about it. Ought to know better than effectively prejudicing, as he put it, a process that results in the fate of a man who, on current polling, could be our next Prime Minister in the hands of a relatively lowly official at one of our smallest police forces.
I think the way that Francis put it made it sound, and rightly, I think, I found it very interesting because that's an angle that hasn't been discussed very much. It made it, frankly, sound terminal. For someone in Keir Starmer's position, as you say, a potential future Prime Minister and a lawyer, to have undermined the rule of law in such a profound way, particularly given that he's clearly done so for political purposes and would have done so knowingly, because as Francis Hoare laid out there, this is something that he absolutely would have understood the nature of a fixed penalty notice and the idea that the police don't simply make decisions about who is guilty and who isn't, that actually if he was acting with integrity, and he wants to be seen as acting with integrity, then he would have objected to the fixed penalty notice and insisted that he had done no wrong if he was confident that he had done no wrong, because he would believe that if that was taken to prosecution, then he would be found innocent.
Just two little things to chew over as well. Andrew Bridgen tweeted in the last couple of minutes suggesting that maybe it's the Metropolitan Police who are looking into the Downing Street parties who should actually take charge of this.
So you've got a kind of
for
parity.
Consistency's sake. I think that's unlikely to happen given the fact it happened in Durham. Also, there's this question about what does he resign over, because Dominic Cummings wasn't fined by the police, but it was noted that he probably broke the covert rules. Now, what happens if Durham police don't fine him but do conclude he may or probably broke the rules? I don't know where we are with that.
Well, I'll tell you where we are with it, Darren. I'll tell you partly where we are on that. And I refer to a tweet in the last few minutes from Philip Pullman, the well-known children's author. And he's quite outspoken on Twitter. And this is the measure of how a small police force is getting dragged into the maelstrom of frontline politics. Philip Pullman writes, with all the majestic impartiality of the law, Durham police, this is your point, Darren, refrained from investigating Dominic Cummings because he was a friend of the Prime Minister. That's obviously a very serious allegation, and one that's you could argue without foundation at all, and continue to investigate Keir Starmer because he's the leader of the Labour Party. I think there's quite a lot of nonsense in that tweet, but it's a reminder of how Durham police are being dragged into things.
And just very finally and quickly on this, Downing Street will be watching, obviously, this very interestingly as well. There is a scenario where Keir Starmer doesn't get fined, but will get a lot of political benefit from appearing to be a politician of principle who's prepared to do so. There is a possibility, of course, that he is fined and he has to resign. And under those circumstances, particularly if Boris Johnson is fined for a second or third time, those calls for the Prime Minister to go would potentially also, well, not potentially, they would grow louder as well. So I think there will be, even though it's a really big gamble for Keir Starmer, clearly, Downing Street's pretty nervous about this story as well. Interestingly, today, they were telling all their MPs and the Minister doing the round this morning not to call on Keir Starmer to resign because they know that this could backfire on Number 10.
Just before, Darren, I know you've got to go at 5 o'clock, but just in terms of who else might be thinking about what this story means for them personally, what's happening in the mind of Lisa Nandy, what's happening in the mind of Andy Burnham right
Well, indeed. I mean, really interesting. I need to properly look into this, what the circumstances are for Andy Burnham. He's not clearly, of course, an MP, so I'm not entirely sure whether he could stand. But yes, I mean, Lisa Nandy giving interviews yesterday. Of course,
Mr. Rules.
There will always be leadership candidates, and there is a thought process, you know, for the Labour Party that if Keir Starmer was to resign on this issue, it would put pressure on Boris Johnson, and it might lead to potentially a more popular Labour leader taking over. We know that Keir Starmer has struggled to connect with the British public, but that is way down the line. But for Keir Starmer, and this must have been a difficult decision in the end, though, for him as well, because he does know, as someone who's only been Labour leader for 2 years, and as someone who's a former director of public contributions, he really has staked not just his career, but actually his reputation on the line with this call today.
Darren, thanks very much indeed. Darren McCaffrey, our political editor. Emma Webb's going to stay with me. Let me just share some of your thoughts on this. You've been emailing in as well, as you might expect. This one, has the country gone mad? Why have we arrived at this point? We were in a pandemic, and the police forces in each part of the country seemingly used different criteria when assessing whether COVID rules were broken. Lots of knives out. Don't care what Starmer and Rayner do. They didn't have to run the country during the pandemic. Superfluous to me. Boris and Rishi should just carry on like adults, getting on with the job and ignoring the childish drama. And this, finally, this is the reaction Starmer wanted against people breaking the rules. Let him have it. It's 5 o'clock. You're with Colin Brazier on GB News, on TV, online and on digital radio. We're going to stay with this breaking story about the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, who says he will resign if he's fined for breaking lockdown rules. That's part of what he said. There's more. Don't go anywhere.
Good afternoon from the GB Newsroom. I'm Tamsin Roberts. It's 5 o'clock. Sir Keir Starmer has said he will step down as Labour leader if he's fined by police. It's after an investigation was launched into allegations he broke coronavirus rules at a curry and beer gathering in Durham in April of last year. Labour's deputy leader, Angela Rayner, who was also at the event, has also said she'd quit if fined, but insists no rules were broken at the event. Sir Keir says he has always followed the rules. The Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, has backed Sir Keir, saying the British public deserve politicians who know the rules apply to them. They deserve politicians who hold themselves to the highest standards. OK, let's just move on to some breaking news that we're getting now. Police have carried out 2 controlled explosions on a suspicious vehicle in Westminster as a precautionary measure. They've closed roads in the area, we're hearing. Police say emergency services are dealing with the incident near Westminster Abbey. We'll bring you more on that story, of course, as we get it. OK, moving on now. DUP leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson says his party will only go back into government if a UK government takes action over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Meanwhile, Northern Ireland's
The message is one of hope. It's also one of optimism for the future, where political leaders work together and they make politics work. That's my commitment as a political leader and as an incoming First Minister. So there can be no excuses. There can be no attempt by the DUP or by anyone else to punish the public and leave workers and families high and dry now or in the time ahead. As a First Minister for all, I intend to work with those from different political perspectives through partnership and not division.
Sinn Féin's Michelle O'Neill speaking there. Russian president claims he's fighting for the motherland as he defended the invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin made the comments in Moscow's Red Square amid its annual military parade, celebrating victory in World War II. Speaking this morning, the UK's Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, says the Kremlin is trying to intimidate others during its celebrations today.
Putin, his inner circle and his generals are now mirroring fascism and tyranny of 77 years ago, repeating the errors of the last century's totalitarian regimes. They are showing the same disregard for human lives, national sovereignty and the rules-based international system.
Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukraine will do everything to end the war.
Just yesterday in the Luhansk region, 60 people were killed by a Russian bomb. Peaceful people. They were hiding from shelling in the building of a regular school which was attacked by Russian airstrikes. To do so is to imitate precisely the evil that the Nazis brought to Europe. We must do everything we can to end the war as soon as possible with the victory of freedom. For the longer the war, the greater the benefits of tyranny and the greater the loss of freedom.
Metropolitan Police Officer David Carrick has been charged with 3 more counts of rape. The Crown Prosecution Service has increased the total charges against him to 44 offences involving 12 separate women. The 47-year-old will appear at Westminster Magistrates Court on Friday. The boss of Scottish Power says more needs to be done to lower energy bills ahead of winter as prices are predicted to go up again. Keith Anderson has urged the government to take action, adding that bills are due to rise by almost £1,000 for millions of households by next winter. This is GB News. I'll bring you more news as it happens. Now, though, it's back to Colin.
Coming up to 5:05, you're with GB News, and we're bringing you a reaction to the news that Sir Keir Starmer, leader of the opposition, has said in the last hour that he will, quote, do the right thing and step down as Labour leader, and his important bit, if he's fined by Durham police over an allegation that he broke coronavirus laws at a curry and beer gathering in Durham around about a year ago. The deputy leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, has also said she will stand down if she is fined as well. Let's have a listen to what Sir Keir had to say.
We all found the rules frustrating at times, and I'm no exception to that. I had to isolate 6 times during COVID, pulling me away from my work and the things that I love. But I did it because we followed the rules. The idea that I would then casually break those rules is wrong. And frankly, I don't believe those accusing me believe it themselves. They are just trying to feed cynicism, to get the public to believe all politicians are the same. I'm here to say that they're not. I believe in honour, integrity, and the principle that those who make the laws must follow them. And I believe that politicians who undermine that principle undermine trust in politics, undermine our democracy, and undermine Britain. I'm absolutely clear that no laws were broken. They were followed at all times. I simply had something to eat while working late in the evening, as any politician would do days before an election. But if the police decide to issue me with a fixed penalty notice, I would, of course, do the right thing and step down.
Sir Keir Starmer addressing the cameras within the last hour or thereabouts. Well, the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, this is not a line that's going to surprise anybody, has backed Sir Keir, saying the British public deserve politicians who know the rules apply to them. They deserve politicians who hold themselves to the highest standards. They deserve politicians who put our country first. They will always get that from Keir Starmer and from Labour. Let's turn to our political correspondent, Tom Harwood, who's in Westminster, close by where that announcement was made. Tom, welcome to you. Where to begin? Let's start with the words of Francis Hall, a leading barrister who I interviewed about half an hour ago, who could scarcely contain his fury. He felt this was an attempt almost to influence Durham Police. It was prejudicial in his mind, particularly from a former Director of Public Prosecution, somebody who knows his way around the law as well as Sir Keir Starmer does, to put effectively what he saw as pressure on Durham Police. What say you?
Well, it's not just Francis Hall who has been saying that, but indeed allies of Sir Keir Starmer have been briefing journalists that is one of the advantages of going so loud and so public with this pledge to resign if the leader of the Labour Party receives a fixed penalty notice. It's a big gamble, and one that I suppose on one side of the equation the Labour Party is thinking might make it less likely that the leader of the Labour Party is fined for this potential COVID transgression. But on the other hand, this could be the most monumental self-own goal. This could be a real catastrophe that the Labour Party has set up for themselves, exploding this story into something that is leading national bulletins, that everyone is talking about, making everyone look at the evidence that Sir Keir Starmer had a curry with up to 30 people at a time when indoor socialising was illegal in this country. Some big questions to ask of the Labour leader, although unfortunately at today's event, very few journalists getting to ask them. Only 3 journalists were allowed into that press conference. In the most extraordinary closed nature, the Labour Party blocked other journalists from going in. I'm standing outside the back of Labour HQ right now. We were expecting that Sir Keir Starmer may scuttle out the back door of what's called Southside Labour HQ, although now there's speculation he may come out the front now that a lot of journalists have come around the back. This is someone who has not been that open to lots of questions, because lots of questions do remain about what exactly Sir Keir Starmer would do, not just in the instance that he would receive a fixed penalty notice, but what if Durham Police were to say that he may well have broken the rules, but they won't issue a fixed penalty notice, as they did with Dominic Cummings? Well, the leader of the Labour Party at the time called for Dominic Cummings to resign despite not receiving a fixed penalty notice. It would seem a touch hypocritical for Sir Keir Starmer to then not himself resign had a similar situation taken place with him. There are many questions to ask, and of course the Labour leader went to ground for the previous 3 days not answering those questions. Reportedly, incredible division within the Labour Party as to whether this particular press conference was a wise move at all. Has the Labour leader carried out a brilliant piece of politics there, setting himself up as someone who is different from other politicians, or has he simply set himself up for a fool? It is quite extraordinary now that the fate of the leader of the Labour Party and the deputy leader of the Labour Party now rests with a small police force in the north of England.
And it rests with them, Tom. Yes, of course it does. But also, as you've made clear, you've copped for a lot of flack from some people who said, there goes Tom Harwood, a dog with a bone, let go this Durham Beergate thing, that nothing comes of it. Actually, and then you get the memo over the weekend, Mail on Sunday, allegations that seem to contradict the account that was given before. The point about investigations is you can't control where they're going. Even now, there may be somebody reviewing smartphone footage thinking, I'll view this in a new light. As things currently stand, 6 weeks before we get a determination by Durham Police, he may feel he'll beat the rap. Things change.
Things do change, and we do know there have already been inconsistencies in the account of the Labour Party. Not only has the Labour Party claimed first that the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, was not there, when then new footage emerged that showed that she was indeed there. They also claimed sporadically that this was something that seemed to be not a planned event, that simply people got hungry and curry was ordered. Those were the words of the leader of the Labour Party. Well, a leaked memo in the Mail on Sunday over the weekend revealed that this was a planned event. It was in the Labour Party op note. It was in a document that at the top of that document said national lockdown, and at the bottom of that document had a space for curry, an 80-minute set aside for a curry as the last thing of the day, not any scheduled work after that, despite the claims of the leader of the Labour Party. The more this story is looked into, the more the inconsistencies seem to bubble up. And of course, many of of them are trivial. Of course, these people were in the same room anyway and working before, and then sat down for their curry and beer. However, the same trivial situation could equally be explained of what the Prime Minister and indeed Chancellor got up to on the 19th of June 2020, when they were in the same room anyway for work, and there happened to be a cake and a singing of Happy Birthday there as well. Really, the two issues, the more they're looked into, seem to be more comparable. And ultimately, the fact that the leader of the Labour Party called on the Chancellor to resign for something that many consider, most consider perhaps, to be such a low bar. The fine which Rishi Sunak received was clearly something that was not a large transgression. Well, that opens him up to enormous calls. That opens the leader of the Labour Party up to enormous calls of hypocrisy with, yes, something that doesn't seem to be the largest transgression in the world, but very few would say it's particularly different to the situation that the Chancellor found himself in half a year before.
Tom, thanks very much indeed. Tom Harwood there in Westminster. Just a brief word with Emma Webb, who's alongside me in the studio throughout the course of the next hour. Emma Webb, commentator, who's been commenting on this story, as many people are online and elsewhere. Just on the use of language there, Tom Harwood talking about Keir Starmer scuttling. We know what he means, and there has been a bit of scuttling going on for the last 48 hours from Keir Starmer, avoiding the press, avoiding questions. And in a sense, does that not vindicate his decision to say, I'll resign? Because actually, he's made his position absolutely clear. He won't be hounded now for an answer because he's given the answer.
I think that he is mistaken if he thinks that is going to be the case. And if I were advising the Conservative Party right now, I would be hammering home on the point that Francis Hoare made when he said that actually, even in the ideal scenario that Keir Starmer is hoping for, the scenario where he's found to have done nothing wrong, which I think would be problematic anyway, because as Tom Harwood mentions there, that would seem to show some kind of double standard between the Met and Durham police, where it's Rishi versus the way that they've responded to these allegations against Keir Starmer. But even in the best case scenario, the scenario where he's found to have done nothing wrong, I think the point that Francis Hoare made is far more important in the grand scheme of things, which is actually in doing so and in saying that he's going to resign in this way, he's actually made a grievous and profound act of undermining the rule of law itself. And if I were advising the Conservative Party, I would be saying hammer home on that, because that is the real point to all of this.
He may calculate that it's fine to annoy lawyers as long as it doesn't annoy the general public. We'll come back to that thought, Emma. For now, thanks very much. We're joined by research fellow at the Bow Group, Benjamin Loughnane, for some thoughts on this. Benjamin, welcome to you. Your thoughts?
Hello. I think it's deeply cynical and inappropriate for Keir Starmer to, in any way, try to influence the outcome of this investigation by saying that the consequences of being fined are that he'll resign as leader of the opposition. That puts an enormous amount of pressure on Durham police to get it right. And if they think that there's any doubt whatsoever, they will shirk away from issuing that fine. However, I think that he's playing a sort of a gamble here. He thinks that if he doesn't get fined, then he will be able to turn around to the Prime Minister and say, oh, well, you did get fined, and Rishi Sunak did get fined, and you two now both have to resign because I set that precedent early on by saying I would do the same thing if I would be fined. You'd be forgiven for suspecting he might have had a tip-off, perhaps, that he's not going to get fined, or, even worse, that he thinks that he's followed the letter of the law, even though he clearly hasn't followed the spirit of the law. And I think for someone who's involved in making those laws, someone who, as the leader of the opposition, should have opposed those laws if he disagreed with them, rather than simply trying to find ways to weasel around them and find the loopholes so that he technically follows them, but actually is off having beers and curries with those people after a day of work. I think that shows an even more cynical side than just following them or just breaking them. It shows that someone who's a former director...
Benjamin, I think some people might say that's imputing a lot, and there's lots that we don't know there. One thing we can state with conviction is that everybody had trouble. You, I can't speak for you, but and I think many of our viewers and listeners, and certainly members of our executive branch and MPs and cabinet members, all had trouble at one point or another over the course of the best part of 2 years in working out how to interpret some complicated rules during lockdown in real-life scenarios, not on a page, but in real life. And I think anybody looking in from the outside today, hearing that the man who the polls suggest is likely to be our next Prime Minister is on the point of resigning over a biryani and a beer, would find the whole thing utterly baffling.
Well, yes, that's one thing to try and find the best way possible to go along with the rules whilst going about your normal life if you are an ordinary citizen. But someone like Keir Starmer, who spent 2 years doing absolutely nothing to oppose what many regarded as cruel and, frankly, inappropriate rules that were being set to deal with COVID, he should have done more in Parliament to oppose those rules as the leader of the opposition, rather than simply ticking off and rubber stamping everything the government did. As the leader of the opposition, if he didn't agree with the rules, then he shouldn't have continued to vote for them.
And with that, Benjamin had gone. Benjamin Loughnane will say thanks very much indeed. Let's go to Darlington, County Durham. Chris Lloyd is the chief feature writer at the Northern Echo. Chris, hi to you. You've got one heck of a story for the next 6 to 8 weeks, we're told.
Yes, it's rather like the Dominic Cummings thing that kept us entertained for weeks and weeks and weeks up here, because as you said earlier on, the way these stories have a habit of kind of running away with themselves. And the Cummings story up here, when he came to his parents' house and then drove off to Barnard Castle to test his eyes, that kind of run about what sort of planning permission did the parents have for his house, and had they paid the right tax on that. So you can never tell where these stories are going to lead to.
Well, one thing we can say with confidence, Chris, is that we've got a situation where the future political direction of the country could effectively be in the hands of a fairly junior officer of one of the smaller police forces in the country, the Durham Police. And that's one heck of a thing.
It is quite remarkable. I guess it's kind of a symptomatic of where we are at the moment, because this story has dominated the headlines, and Boris Johnson was trying to clear it before Christmas, and yet here we are in May still talking about the same story. And I think there's a very interesting thing about the politicisation of police forces as well, where we have police and crime commissioners on the margins of this, and Durham, of course, is a Labour PCC now. So that whole question, I think, comes into whether we like the roles of PCCs and the way we've politicised our police forces.
Yeah, so some papers, somebody's going to have a picture tomorrow, Chris, let me speculate. Whether it's a chief constable, whether it's a police and crime commissioner, whether it's a sergeant on the desk at the police station in Sedgefield, somebody's going to have a picture and a name of the person who ultimately gets to make the decision, I suggest to you.
Yes, I was told that there are a small team of officers. I cannot believe they will just leave it to one junior person to look into this. As I said, the whole Dominic Cummings thing really took over Durham Force for quite a while. So I'm sure that there will be senior people involved in this as well.
Yeah. Chris, we'll leave it there, but appreciate your time. I know you'll have some deadlines to hit. There's a big story in County Durham for the Northern Echo. Thanks very much indeed. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Emma Webb's alongside me. Chris is an old colleague of mine from the Northern Echo, and he's been slightly coy there, but I think he's only half right. I think ultimately this is a quasi-judicial process. Is he going to is Keir Starmer going to get a fixed penalty notice or not? If you're in a court of law, it's a jury. Ultimately, what's going on? Is this a show of hands? The majority have it? It comes down to one person, ultimately, it seems to me.
It's, just to observe the way that the process has been described at Durham Police, even relating to Dominic Cummings, we just take a moment to observe how completely balmy and absurd it is that an entire constabulary would take up all of their time looking into a fixed penalty notice for somebody who had a biryani and a beer. This just goes to show how, and I think that this actually gets almost to the heart of the matter, not only with Beergate but also with Partygate, which is that these rules and the point that Francis Hoare made, which is that these rules from the very beginning were absurd, and they were such that they were almost impossible for anybody to follow perfectly to the letter or to the spirit. And for someone like Keir Starmer to be so confident that he isn't going to fall foul of this, when we've already seen that Rishi, having happened to be in a room that a cake entered, has found himself up a certain creek without a paddle, I think that the entire situation is completely absurd, and we've got so many problems that we need to be dealing with: rising energy energy prices, geopolitical issues, and instead we have entire constabularies that are being consumed by these minor and insane points of law. And as Francis Hall pointed out, these are the same, and Lord Lucas pointed out, these are the same as a parking ticket. It's essentially, it's a fine, and that's all.
But how did we get there? We got there partly because the leader of Her Majesty's opposition put it there by saying, actually, Prime Minister, if you get a fixed penalty notice, sling your hook, you need to resign. And now he faces the same level of scrutiny. By the same logic, he has to resign if he's found guilty. He's made his own bed.
And quite rightly, Francis Hall said that he's hoisted himself on his own petard. And I think that in many ways, that the politicians who were behind the making of these rules in the first place had it coming that they would fall foul of laws that everybody else fell foul of. And many people around the country have received fines. Those fines should clearly be waived in some way because it was unjust to begin with. This wasn't the sort of power that any government should have had to impose. The rules were absurd and unfollowable, and they found this out the hard way.
It's funny how the news can often feel like a parable on priggishness and sanctimony, doesn't it? Anyway, that's just my thoughts. Emma, thanks very much indeed. Avalanche of emails from you. We'll have a look at some of them very shortly, but first, we'll have a look at the weather.
Hi there, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. Increasingly cloudy skies are arriving from the northwest as a band of rain pushes south through the rest of the day, but still some warmth and some brightness ahead of the rain as high pressure clings on in the southeast. That high pressure, though, is losing its grip across the UK. Low pressure towards the northwest is pushing a series of weather fronts in, and it's been a wet day so far across Scotland and Northern Ireland. That rain then pushing into northern England, parts of Wales, the Midlands overnight. Staying mostly clear of the southeast, just some dribs and drabs of rain here, but increasingly cloudy in the south, and as a result, England and Wales staying mild overnight, 12 to 14 Celsius. Scotland and Northern Ireland sees the rain clear and temperatures dip into the mid to high single figures, but blustery showers replace the rain for northern and western Scotland as well as Northern Ireland. And elsewhere, it's a damp start to the day for much of England and Wales, but the rain and the cloud quickly clears the southeast. By lunchtime, most places see the sunny spells arriving behind the rain, and a fine day to come eventually for southern and southeastern areas, 20 Celsius there in London. But for Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England, scattered showers as well as the sunny spells, so a cooler day here, 13 to 16 Celsius, and some longer spells of rain into the north and west of Scotland, perhaps Northern Ireland and Northern England into the start of Wednesday. But further south, cloudier skies once again arrive overnight, and 12 Celsius will be the low as we begin the day on Wednesday here. Mid to high single figures once again further north. Further showers to come on Wednesday for Scotland, for Northern Ireland and Northern England. Sunny spells in between. But in the south, a lot of cloud cover and some outbreaks of rain pushing into southwestern and southern parts. That clears away for Thursday and Friday, turning drier in the south, showers in the north.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
£5:28. Welcome back. You're with Colin Brazier on GB News, on TV, online and on digital radio. Throughout today's show, we're bringing you a reaction to Sir Keir Starmer's commitment to, and I quote, do the right thing and step down. No, he's not resigned, but he's threatening to, if he is fined by Durham police over an allegation that he broke coronavirus laws at a curry and beer gathering. Let's say no more than that. In County Durham, in the city of Durham. Let's have a listen to what Sir Keir had to say about an hour and a half ago.
We all found the rules frustrating at times, and I'm no exception to that. I had to isolate 6 times during COVID, pulling me away from my work and the things that I love. But I did it because we followed the rules. The idea that I would then casually break those rules is wrong. And frankly, I don't believe those accusing me believe it themselves. They are just trying to feed cynicism, to get the public to believe all politicians are the same. I'm here to say that they're not. I believe in honour, integrity, and the principle that those who make the laws must follow them. And I believe that politicians who undermine that principle, undermine trust in politics, undermine our democracy, and undermine Britain. I'm absolutely clear that no laws were broken. They were followed at all times. I simply had something to eat while working late in the evening, as any politician would do days before an election. But if the police decide to issue me with a fixed penalty notice, I would, of course, do the right thing and step down.
Well, let's turn to Stephen Woolfe, former UKIP MEP, but also has worked as a barrister for many years as well. Stephen Woolfe, thanks for your time. We were talking to a fellow barrister, Francis Hoare, an hour or so ago. He was making the point that this is not a situation that Sir Keir Starmer, as a former Director of Public Prosecutions for the Crown Prosecution Service, very senior lawyer, should have put Durham police in.
Well, absolutely. I think it's very smart politics by Keir Starmer to suggest that he hasn't broken the rules because, in his words, he was simply having something to eat during a campaign with people. Now, the public were not going to see too much of a difference between what Keir Starmer did and what Boris Johnson did. And what I would also note is look at the body language and the facial movements of Keir Starmer. He really feels under pressure by this because he knows he's on the edge of breaking the law, whether he thinks so or not. And that's why it's smart politics. It's smart politics because if he is found to be given a fixed penalty notice by Durham, he can then come out as an honourable politician by resigning, and so would Angela Rayner. And that would therefore put pressure on Boris Johnson. If not, he can then continue to put Boris Johnson under pressure by saying, look, I followed all the rules. I think the difficulty for him, though, is he's still bound by the principles of being a member of the bar, and that also weighs heavy on his own conscience.
Stephen, he won't look so smart if he's given a fixed penalty notice and he's promised to go as a consequence.
No, he won't. But what I think it will also do, there's clever politics coming into this, is to make a defining line between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. Because if he stands down, as will Angela Rayner, we've heard that she'll do exactly the same, then they will say that we, the Labour Party, understand all the pressures that the people went through. They understand the confusions that we all had to do. But we have done the right thing, in his own words. Now it's over to you, Boris Johnson. And when you look at some of the reactions of the public during the local elections that we've just had, where Northerners and Northern MPs particularly said the attitude of those in power and Boris Johnson's team seemed to lose them votes. I think this is why he is saying this. Even if he has to step down and in comes another MP from the Labour Party to take over, they will say, we've done the right thing, look at the Conservatives, and they can continue to push that line that the Tories are liars and cheats and don't understand people.
He knows his way around the law. Stephen Wolfe, you know your way around the law. He presumably has made a determination, an educated guess, that on the basis of what's happened, he stands a pretty good chance of not getting a fixed penalty notice. But as a lawyer, educators, tell us how often you go into a legal situation expecting one result, but then things don't quite work out that way.
Look, no lawyer will turn around and ever say to you, I will give you 100%. That guarantee that you're either not convicted or that you will be convicted. That is a poor lawyer that actually says so, unless you're, even when you're caught with a knife in the back, as they say. So he has made a smart calculation, I think, that he believes that the eating after work argument will work. But I don't think it's any guarantee, because the dangerous thing he did, and I think this is where the cynicism I've heard of your other speakers tonight, is that he's putting enormous pressure on Durham police before they've given a result. And I don't think that is appropriate. I think that could actually backfire on him, because imagine you're now in Durham police and you allow him off. The arguments are going to be very clear that the Metropolitan Police are able to issue a notice for Boris Johnson, but Durham police are being partisan and not doing so for the Labour Party. That's his big danger. And I suspect now that Durham police are going to be in the midst of a massive political crisis internally. The CPS are going to be looking at this and saying, we can't be seen to differentiate. And that's why at the moment, I would suggest he's on extremely sticky wicket. And I believe that it'll be edging to him being given the fixed penalty notice.
Wow. Stephen Wolfe, appreciate your time as ever. Stephen Wolfe there talking about the reaction. The conversations are going on in Durham right now. We'll bring you the reaction of Durham's Police and Crime Commissioner after the break, and the news bulletin coming up.
Good afternoon, I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB Newsroom. It's 5:35. Sir Keir Starmer has said he will step down as Labour leader if he's fined by police. It's after an investigation was launched into allegations he broke coronavirus rules at a curry and beer gathering in Durham in April last year. Labour's deputy leader Angela Rayner, who was also at the event, has said she will also quit if fined, but insists no rules were broken at the event. Sir Keir says he's always followed the rules.
I had to isolate 6 times during COVID, pulling me away from my work and the things that I love. But I did it because we followed the rules. The idea that I would then casually break those rules is wrong. And frankly, I don't believe those accusing me believe it themselves.
DUP leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson says his party will not form an executive until the UK government takes action over the Northern Ireland Protocol.
I'm not prepared to watch and stand on the sidelines as the can is kicked further down the road. That's not acceptable. They've had months to sort this out. It is their responsibility to do so. And I'm saying to the EU and to the UK government, I'm not interested in their parallel universe. I'm interested in the real world, which means sort this out and take the action now to remove the Irish Sea border.
Meanwhile, Northern Ireland's incoming First Minister, Sinn Féin's Michelle O'Neill, says the DUP and the British government must accept and respect the result of the Assembly election. Her party won a historic 27 seats in the Assembly elections last week. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Brandon Lewis, has been holding talks with the 5 party leaders in Stormont today. Russia's president has claimed he is fighting for the motherland as he defended the invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin made the comments in Moscow's Red Square during the annual military parade, which celebrates victory in World War II. The UK's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace is accusing the Kremlin of trying to intimidate other countries during today's celebrations. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Back to Colin in just a moment.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Nearly 20 to 6. It's been an important hour and a half, nearly 2 hours in the life of Sir Keir Starmer and his future prospects as leader of the Labour movement, and also a potential Prime Minister in waiting if the opinion polls are to be believed. I say that in the context of his commitment to doing, quote, the right thing and stepping down as Labour leader if he's fined by police over an allegation that he broke coronavirus laws at a curry and beer gathering in County Durham last year. The opposition leader repeatedly denied breaking the laws in a televised statement earlier. He accused the Conservatives, who are accusing him of breaking lockdown rules, of, quote, trying to feed cynicism to get the public to believe all politicians are the same. This you don't necessarily. Within the last hour, the Durham Police and Crime Commissioner, Joy Allen, has been commenting on this. This is what was said. As I have said previously, I do not and will not interfere with the operational independence of the constabulary. However, I am confident that Durham Constabulary, as one of the top-performing police forces in England and Wales, will carry out the investigation meticulously and with complete impartiality, without fear or favour. What have you been saying? Here's the flavour. If he was truly sincere about the situation, he wouldn't need a script. Another point of view, people saying Starmer should resign for being under investigation are wrong. Boris didn't do that. Julie says, amongst the obvious hypocrisy, Starmer keeps making a big thing of having to isolate 6 times. Now we know why. He must have been mixing with a lot of people. Well, it is quite comical on one level, but it's also very possibly very po-faced about the whole thing, isn't it? The bigger problem is having a serial liar for Prime Minister. It seems honesty and integrity are not required of our politicians. Let's just get the thoughts of Emma Webb, who's been alongside me throughout today's show. I almost checked myself there, Emma, because, of course, there was a time, and we all understand why, that to say anything remotely funny about coronavirus was to risk an avalanche of criticism, because thousands of people died from the virus. But there is something in the, when you listen to the words I just uttered, that to somebody on Mars or even just in another country, listening to the prospect of a leading politician, according to the polls, likely to be our next Prime Minister, offering to resign because of a biryani and a beer, it does seem a bit daft.
It is. It's deeply comical. And I think from the very beginning, many people who were pointing out the absurdity of some of these rules were able to see the funny side of it. And I think some gallows humour is sometimes what is required. And this is clearly an amusing situation. And to go back to the words of Francis Horne, he said that they have been hoisted on their own petard. I think seeing this this statement being put out by Keir Starmer and the way that he delivered the speech, to me, seemed very insincere, like an insincere head boy who's been caught doing something wrong. And for him to insist on the fact that not all politicians are the same, really trying to hammer home the fact that Labour is not like the Conservative Party, that this isn't a sleaze scandal within Labour itself. And as one of the viewers mentioned, they're repeatedly saying that he isolated 6 times. And many people at the time were even saying that his repeated isolation seemed a little bit silly, that this is a man who has been vaccinated and was possibly being viewed as isolating in the first place in a way that was almost virtue signalling. So I think that the entire situation taken as a whole does seem rather silly and daft. But on a more serious note, as Francis Horne said, and I'm going to keep
Francis Horne, the barrister.
And I'll keep going back to it, I think that he's absolutely right that there is something very, very profound at stake here. And we shouldn't allow Keir Starmer to get away with the political sleight of hand that he's trying to pull here, because I think that he has potentially profoundly undermined the rule of law. And that's something that should be taken very seriously.
Well, Emma, let's reflect on this with our next guest, because we do not have a written constitution in this country. We kind of make it up as we go along. Let's turn to a constitutional historian, Rafe Hadel-Mancu, to reflect on that. Rafe, welcome to you. We've talked to a couple of barristers in the last hour or thereabouts who are deeply uncomfortable with a situation where one of the country's smallest police forces is going to make a determination that could ultimately very much have a big impact on the future political direction of this country. How should we look at this constitutionally?
Well, first of all, I should say that Colin, Schadenfreude is deeply un-Christian emotion, and so I'm going to have to go to confession this week, as I've rarely seen someone hoisted on their own petard quite so spectacularly. And it is quite amazing to think that there is a major incident room at Durham looking into this incident. Major incident rooms are normally given to things like kidnappings and murders. I'm not so sure that it is worrying constitutionally, because this is a catastrophic mess created by Keir Starmer, who has created this so-called constitutional crisis. And I'm actually not sure that this statement goes far enough, because you have to remember it was Keir Starmer who wanted Boris Johnson to resign the moment that the police investigation started. No ifs or buts. Innocent until proven guilty wasn't in this lawyer's lexicon when it came to Partygate. So if he is indeed a man of principle, there can be only one conclusion, and that's that he needs to resign. He doesn't need to resign because of the curry and beer, as Emma and others have said. It's rank stupidity to have some of these rules in place. But it's the hypocrisy, it's the obfuscation, it's the self-righteousness. And, hypocrisy is what the British voters detest more than anything else. And Keir knows that. He, after all, was the man with the great catchphrase, "It's one rule for them and it's one rule for us." Well, it appears as if he's a them, not an us.
Right.
Yeah, you put it so beautifully, Rafe, but I just wonder that the lawyers may be outraged, whether the public will be too.
Well, one thing no one has raised really is why actually has this all come to light now after the local elections? I find this fascinating. If this information had come to light, the extra information, that caused Durham to do this, had come a few weeks or months ago, would we have seen a different result in the elections? I imagine Labour would have got pummeled a bit more. Maybe it would have gone to the Lib Dems rather than the Tories. I find that rather interesting. But I think the public are concerned about this. Remember, Lisa Nandy quite rightly warned him not to go full throttle on Partygate. We've got to deal with the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, NHS backlogs, the Ukraine crisis, and we focused for the last few weeks and months
particularly through Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's questions on Growlergate, on misogyny, on Partygate, on the cakes, such inconsequential, superficial things of interest only to the media bubble of Westminster and media, and ignoring the facts that concern the British public. So I think that they will be concerned that he has been hoisted on his own petard for focusing on these very issues.
Thanks so much. Rafe Hadelmanku joining us there. Let's turn to Sebastian Milbank, who's the online editor at the Critic magazine, for some thoughts on this one. Sebastian, what do you think?
Good afternoon. Well, I think not so much a sleight of hand, but a high-stakes political gamble. Keir Starmer clearly thinks he hasn't breached the rules, and I don't think he would be making such a strong statement if he didn't think he had. You don't go all in unless you think you have a strong hand. But that said, I think he's making a mistake. You should never risk your political career for a single news cycle, a single issue, a single political battle. And I think he's also not representing the interests of Labour voters and members in risking the Labour Party and the entire Labour movement on an issue of this kind of triviality.
Triviality, yes, but it raises other important principles, doesn't it? I mean, I've been saying for the last hour or more that, as a journalist, we're taught as journalists to be very careful about prejudicing proceedings, any quasi-judicial proceeding. That's what this is. And yet, in the most obvious way, he has done. We're about to play a clip from a barrister who makes exactly that point. But that's not trivial, the idea of somebody who might be our future Prime Minister saying to a very small police force, if you arrive at this decision, I'm going to do this. How can that not be prejudicial?
Well, I think in some ways it is. I think precisely Starmer has taken what could be a trivial issue. It's as our last guest said, he's made it fill the news cycles. And I think he's making a grave mistake because his job as Labour leader is to talk about things that affect his members and his voters. It's the cost of living, it's inequality, it's housing. And I think he's also made this a battle of personalities of Boris Johnson, and he's made it personal. I don't think that's a battle he can necessarily win. I think it's somewhat, if you're looking at this as a Labour leader, you're looking at it like, Clem Attlee against Churchill in 45. You're trying to make, you ought to be making it about the issues and the policies. And I think Labour leaders, especially a lady like Keir Starmer, who's kind of trying to play the straight man, get in trouble when they lose sight of that.
We're going to leave it there. We're almost out of time, but thanks for yours, Sebastian Milbank there of the Critic magazine. Well, earlier I spoke to the barrister and political commentator Francis Hoare, who was highly critical and quite impassioned about the pressure, as he saw it, Sir Keir Starmer's statement has put on the police investigating the supposed gathering he was involved in Durham.
I find what he has said to be a deeply inappropriate thing for a politician, but particularly for the ex-director of public prosecutions to have said. He must know that he is putting considerable and inappropriate pressure on the Durham Constabulary to dismiss this, because quite clearly it will be far more easy for them to do that rather than to decide to offer him, and that is, as I said, it is only that, to offer him the opportunity to agree to a fixed penalty notice. It is not an appropriate thing to do. And what view one takes, I tend to take the same view as Lord Horton took, which is that these are not offences. I personally believe they should never have been offences, and that it is utterly preposterous that we are discussing curry evenings in Durham and a birthday cake in Downing Street, and even gathering outside in very large gardens in small groups in April in Downing Street. All of these preposterous to suggest that these should have been offences in any circumstances. But I agree that Sir Keir and Boris Johnson have hoisted themselves by their own petard by making them offences, and have certainly both of them look as though they're being deeply hypocritical. But we must focus on the important things and not the triviality. And the important thing here is that Sir Keir Starmer has firstly undermined the important principle that the police do not decide whether or not somebody is innocent or guilty. And secondly, the presumption of innocence. He's undermined that, in my view, by saying what he did, indicating that he would agree to whatever the police decide. And thirdly, he has put deeply inappropriate pressure on the Durham Constabulary by saying that he will resign depending upon what they decide. None of these are appropriate for a leader of the opposition, and they're particularly inexcusable for the ex-DPP.
Francis Hoare is one very angry barrister. Emma Webb's alongside me to reflect on where this story goes next. Let me put a couple of thoughts to you. We read the statement from the Police and Crime Commissioner in County Durham, who is a Labour Police and Crime Commissioner. I suggest to you that some people will be looking at that. They won't be happy about a process that's been going on over years of what some people say as the politicisation of the police's leadership. There's always been police authorities, so I'm not sure how true that is. It'll be in play as a conversation. And the key thing, and we've not really touched on this over the past couple of hours, Emma, but other people will, you can be sure, is whether there's a retrospective element to what Durham police do. I'm reading, you're probably reading too, maybe some of our viewers and listeners are coming across this as well, that Durham police cannot retrospectively issue a fixed penalty notice. So all this, if that's true, is a charade.
In many ways, I think this is actually more interesting and more exciting than Partygate from a sort of political nerd perspective, partly because, as was mentioned earlier, that when it comes to the Durham Constabulary, they're really damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. They'll be viewed as being partial in either way. Either they'll be viewed as having been pressured by Keir Starmer's statement to not issue the fixed penalty notice, or they'll be viewed as having been pressured into issuing the fixed penalty notice because of the perceived pressure on them that they therefore had to defy. So in that sense, they're going to be viewed as being politicised in any which way. And as we've seen in many other areas, particularly when it comes to the culture wars, the police have, and also with lockdown rules, the police have been viewed as being increasingly politicised and failing to deal with crime rather than other, what people would perceive as issues that are not to do with the police. But on the other hand, the thing that I think is most fascinating about this, to sort of round up all of the discussions that have been going on in the last couple of hours, is that there are so many unknowns to this. There are so many unknown consequences of this statement, of the verdict that, I say verdict, that Durham police come to. And so it will be very interesting to see what the implications of this are for the Conservative Party, for the Labour Party, and for the entire discussion around policing and law overall. And there are many, many unknowns to this, and it's very difficult to predict.
Emma Webb, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciated your thoughts throughout the course of this breaking story. Your thoughts too, some emails. Ian says he, Keir Starmer, with Angela Rayner, hounded the government over these issues, and it's come back to haunt him. Perhaps they should have left it alone and concentrated on being an effective opposition on more important issues. Alex says, since when did the police become judge, jury and executioner? Surprised that Starmer, with his legal credentials, has left himself with no appeal. Phil says, maybe Starmer has knowledge that he will not be found. It will not be found that he committed any rule-breaking. How much attention will be paid to this investigation? And Sue says, funny how when Starmer says he does not think any rules were broken, we are supposed to believe it. However, when Boris said he didn't think he'd broken the rules, we are not supposed to believe him. An avalanche of emails today. It's a measure of how engaged with this story you are. Michelle Dewberry's up next. She'll be reflecting on all the different dimensions to this story and maybe deciding that actually it's not the key story of the day, that there is other news around as well. We've focused on it. Make no apology for that. Keep your thoughts coming in. Michelle Dewberry is next.
Hi there, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. Increasingly cloudy skies are arriving from the northwest as a band of rain pushes south through the rest of the day, but still some warmth and some brightness ahead of the rain as high pressure clings on in the southeast. That high pressure, though, is losing its grip across the UK. Low pressure towards the northwest is pushing a series of weather fronts in, and it's been a wet day so far across Scotland and Northern Ireland. That rain then pushing into northern England, parts of Wales, the Midlands overnight. Staying mostly clear of the southeast, just some dribs and drabs of rain here, but increasingly cloudy in the south, and as a result, England and Wales staying mild overnight, 12 to 14 Celsius. Scotland and Northern Ireland sees the rain clear and temperatures dip into the mid to high single figures, but blustery showers replace the rain for northern and western Scotland as well as Northern Ireland. And elsewhere, it's a damp start to the day for much of England and Wales, but the rain and the cloud quickly clears the southeast. By lunchtime, most places see the sunny spells arriving behind the rain, and a fine day to come eventually for southern and southeastern areas, 20 Celsius there in London. But for Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England, scattered showers as well as the sunny spells, so a cooler day here, 13 to 16 Celsius. And some longer spells of rain into the north and west of Scotland, perhaps Northern Ireland and Northern England into the start of Wednesday. But further south, cloudier skies once again arrive overnight, and 12 Celsius will be the low as we begin the day on Wednesday here. Mid to high single figures once again further north. Further showers to come on Wednesday for Scotland, for Northern Ireland and Northern England. Sunny spells in between. But in the south, a lot of cloud cover and some outbreaks of rain pushing into southwestern and southern parts. That clears away for Thursday and Friday, turning drier in the south, showers in the north.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.